Bueno, buenas tardes de nuevo y de vuelta. Vamos con el plato fuerte de la tarde. Cuando estábamos organizando el evento, les pedí a Nuria y a Abel explícitamente que hiciéramos esta intervención de presentación, lo más breve posible, porque obviamente ustedes lo que estarán deseando es escuchar a Neil. Así que no voy a detenerme a hacer una presentación convencional. No voy a repasar todo el historial de méritos, de logros de nuestro protagonista de hoy. Yo creo que para eso, pues obviamente está el libro, ¿no? Y como un intento también pues, de proseguir hablábamos antes de mercantilización, etcétera, les invito a adquirirlo, también con la idea de que esto no es un producto personal, ¿no? Sino básicamente un eslabón en una cadena. Básicamente la compra de los libros sirve para que el proyecto siga adelante y haya nuevos volúmenes, ¿no? Yo lo que voy a hacer es, muy brevemente, insisto, una lectura personal de los rasgos intelectuales que más aprecio en él, con la intención de completar un poco el retrato que aparece en el libro y la imagen que ustedes pueden tener de él ahora mismo, ¿no? Antes de nada, pues obviamente quería agradecer a Nuria y Abel la invitación para escribir el libro, obviamente la organización del evento de hoy, pero más en general la iniciativa de poner en marcha el proyecto de espacios críticos, la colección, que yo creo que es un hito fundamental en la reflexión sobre el espacio en castellano, ¿no? En los últimos años, y esperemos que lo sea durante mucho tiempo. Un hito fundamental, yo creo que sobre todo porque está sirviendo para reunir a gente llegada de lugares muy distintos, ¿no? Y para propiciar este debate que hasta hace poco era bastante difícil de llevar, ¿no? Así que gracias, de verdad, por la iniciativa. Cuando ellos me invitaron a hacer el libro sobre Neil, pues la invitación era muy atractiva, pero también era una invitación difícil, por motivos que seguramente adivinarán. Yo dudé al principio, ¿no? de la oportunidad de hacer el libro, por un motivo muy sencillo. Neil es, y esto yo creo que le va a provocar de nuevo, le va a hacer gracia, ¿no? Neil es el autor más joven que hemos publicado hasta la fecha. Lo es. Si miran el resto de libros, pues se darán cuenta de que son libros normalmente dedicados a autores que están en la etapa final de sus carreras. La única excepción era nuestro querido Neil Smith, y por desgracia pues el destino se lo llevó por el camino. Pero Neil, a diferencia de todos esos autores, es una persona que está en el Ecuador, o incluso quizá ni siquiera ha llegado al Ecuador de su carrera. Lo cual produce cierto vértigo, ¿no? Cuando uno repasa la trayectoria y los logros, produce cierto vértigo. Pero bueno, el hecho es que estamos hablando de un autor que está todavía, que tiene una larga trayectoria por delante, y en ese sentido, bueno, pues el retrato que hace el libro es un retrato destinado a convertirse en un retrato parcial con el paso de los años, ¿no? Y es una advertencia que, bueno, pues a los futuros lectores yo les gustaría hacer. En ese sentido, el libro yo creo que refuerza el carácter de herramienta que tienen la mayor parte de las entregas de la serie Espacios Críticos. Es un libro seguramente destinado a ser superado en el futuro, dentro de unas décadas, por el trabajo que Neil siga desarrollando, y quizás dentro de unos años, dentro de unas décadas, pues tendremos una segunda parte, un segundo volumen sobre Neil Brenner, y nos volveremos a encontrar aquí para presentar pues el resto de su trabajo, ¿no? El otro día, pensando sobre esto, de hecho, se me ocurría que sería difícil imaginar el título que esa segunda parte de libros sobre Neil Brenner, el segundo volumen, podría tener. Sería difícil ahora mismo imaginar ese título, y voy a ya destacar uno de los rasgos que yo más aprecio y que me parecen más remarcables de su trayectoria intelectual: es la tremenda inquietud. que le ha hecho pasar por espacios muy distintos. En ese sentido digo que es difícil imaginar dónde vamos a tener a Neil Brenner dentro de 2 o 3 décadas, en qué posición disciplinar, porque hasta ahora su recorrido es tremendamente extenso, ¿no? Y tremendamente amplio. De alguna forma, a mí me gusta decir que Neil va allí donde considera que está el problema, o para utilizar una palabra de su jerga personal, la problemática, ¿no? He embraces the problematic. Él va allí donde está la problemática, ¿no? Y eso le ha hecho recorrer un periplo pues bastante diverso hasta la fecha, ¿no? Y doy algunas notas biográficas, ¿no? Él comienza estudios de filosofía y enseguida se interesa por la filosofía política de izquierdas, y ese interés le hace ir unos años después o muy poco después a pasar un año entero investigando en uno de los lugares calientes de la teoría política, no solo de la teoría política, sino también del cambio político en ese momento. Estoy hablando del Berlín de principios de los años 90, justo tras la reunificación, en un momento en que Berlín no es solo la sede de toda una reflexión teórica bastante contundente que él va a repasar en ese año fundacional que pasa allí investigando, sino que además Berlín en ese momento es un lugar clave de la reconstrucción de la arquitectura institucional de la Unión Europea, que él va a investigar o de la que se va a ocupar unos años después en su tesis doctoral. Vuelve a Estados Unidos y se va a Chicago porque se ve atraído por una serie de miembros del marxismo analítico que están trabajando en aquel momento, pero enseguida en Chicago se da cuenta de que hay otros campos de la teoría crítica muchísimo más efervescentes en ese momento, y allí que va. Poco después empieza a ser consciente de la importancia de la dimensión espacial para comprender los procesos sociales. Estamos hablando de ese momento en el que se habla del giro espacial, ¿no?, en las ciencias sociales, y pues se va a Los Ángeles a estudiar geografía en un momento en que Los Ángeles, la escuela de Los Ángeles está en plena eclosión, y van a ser profesores suyos personajes como Ed Soya, John Friedman, Michael Storper, Alan Scott, etc., ¿no? Pocos años después le vemos iniciar su carrera académica como profesor en un departamento de sociología y al frente de un centro de estudios urbanos, ¿no? De nuevo, otro desplazamiento disciplinar, ¿no? Y en ese contexto, en el que ya está desarrollando su trabajo con numerosas publicaciones, el desarrollo, la publicación de su tesis, fundamentalmente el New State Spaces, se da cuenta de la importancia y la complejidad de los procesos de producción material y de producción regulatoria de las dinámicas de urbanización, y poco después le vemos de nuevo seguir el problema y desplazarse a una escuela donde los problemas de la producción física de la ciudad están en el centro de la reflexión, a una escuela de diseño rodeado de arquitectos, urbanistas, planificadores, etcétera, etcétera. En ese sentido, como ven, el recorrido, ¿no?, queda un poco de, como decía, un poco de vértigo, ¿no? Filosofía, ciencia política, geografía, sociología, estudios urbanos, el mundo del diseño, y en cada uno de esos espacios él es capaz de hacer una serie de aportaciones que se van a convertir claves, ¿no? Y esto es realmente, yo creo que excepcional. En ese sentido, yo creo que hay que destacar también, segundo rasgo que me gustaría destacar, ¿no?, la valentía de su labor intelectual, porque va a intervenir efectivamente en todos esos distintos espacios intelectuales, en debates que son clave en cada uno de esos momentos y en cada una de esas disciplinas, pero va a hacerlo normalmente a contracorriente de los discursos dominantes en cada momento, ¿no? A contracorriente, con un discurso contraintuitivo, contrahegemónico, etcétera. En ese momento, por ejemplo, una serie de muestras, en un momento en el que todo el mundo habla sobre la globalización y la pérdida de importancia del Estado, Neil viene y nos recuerda el papel protagonista del Estado en la producción precisamente de ese proceso de globalización y cómo construyendo ese espacio global, los espacios estatales son reconfigurados, reescalados, etcétera. En un momento en el que todo el mundo habla de neoliberalismo como una condición consumada, completa, final, él y otros colegas, como también nos recordaba hace un rato Margit, nos hablan de dinámicas de neoliberalización, de cómo se hibridan distintos procesos regulatorios, lo nuevo con los viejos marcos regulatorios y el papel protagonista de las políticas urbanas en ese proceso. Y esa sutileza para percibir o palpar esos matices también les permite mostrar que hay grietas en esos procesos y que en esas grietas existen oportunidades de lucha y de resistencia, ¿no? En un momento en el que mucha gente flirtea con el postestructuralismo y que abandonan paulatinamente los macrorrelatos, para perderse en el detalle del contexto, Neil insiste en reutilizar el instrumental de la teoría crítica, en plantearse grandes preguntas como investigador, en intentar entender el contexto de los contextos, es decir, las pautas estructurales profundas del sistema social y espacial en el que vivimos. Y por supuesto, y más recientemente, en un momento en el que todo el mundo está celebrando la ciudad como el paradigma de este nuestro urbano siglo XXI, pues Neil, de nuevo junto a otros colegas, nos advierte o nos llama la atención sobre esos otros espacios a cuyas espaldas se construye esta magma brillante, ¿no? de las grandes ciudades globales de la actualidad. Nos dice que los procesos de urbanización planetaria están alimentando esas aglomeraciones a costa de espacios rurales, espacios naturales que poco a poco son subsumidos por esa máquina urbanizadora. En fin, como ven, valentía, amplitud de las cuestiones. Esta amplitud a veces a algunos autores les ha hecho sufrir una cierta merma de su intensidad teórica o de su intensidad argumental. Ya les aseguro que esto no es el caso de Neil Brenner. Yo creo que esos estudios iniciales de filosofía hacen que en su ADN teórico la precisión, la voluntad por la precisión y el rigor conceptual sean un material fundamental con el que él trabaja. Muchos pues, hemos tenido la oportunidad de trabajar con él o de escucharle en procesos de trabajo en marcha y esto es muy obvio, ¿no? El intento de retorcer, de apretar y de extraer, estrujar los conceptos al máximo está ahí y es algo que ha hecho en esos distintos escenarios en los que él ha intervenido. Y bueno, pues yo creo que para terminar, dije que no iba a hablar mucho y realmente estoy quizá ocupando demasiado tiempo. Todo esto yo creo que hace que Neil sea uno de esos autores, por desgracia cada vez más raros, que nos ayuda a pensar de forma distinta. Si combinan todos esos rasgos, esos ingredientes de los que estoy hablando, y los leen a través de sus trabajos, verán cómo pues ese cóctel, ¿no? nos ayuda a ver la realidad de forma distinta, que yo creo que es lo mejor que se puede decir de un investigador y de un teórico en ese sentido. Y bueno, cierro simplemente diciendo un último rasgo que yo creo que también le caracteriza y que no puedo dejar de comentar, y es su entusiasmo arrollador y casi siempre contagioso, ¿no? Su energía, que van a poder ver hoy en vivo y en directo, y que yo creo que todos los que hemos convivido con él durante un tiempo pues la conocemos bien, su capacidad de construir una especie de comunidad intelectual a su alrededor gracias a su generosidad en las ideas, en el tiempo y en las good vibes que suele enviar constantemente, en las buenas vibraciones que transmite. No me extiendo más, les dejo con Neil Brenner y disfrútenlo.
Thank you. So that was an incredibly generous introduction. I'm a bit overwhelmed. I'm going to talk today about theory, but maybe just to put this out there immediately. So all theoretical work, I think, is really important, but any individual contribution can only occur within a context of a collective project and community. And that's something that Álvaro is also very much committed to. So, I'm deeply grateful. I want to thank Nuria and Abel for inviting me to contribute to the series and for all of their work in the series. I want to thank Icaria for supporting the series. It's so important to have support for the circulation of critical spatial theory. And we cannot take that for granted, certainly not today. So we have to work together to make that possible, and I just want to acknowledge that support from Icaria, really fundamental. I want to thank all the panelists for their contributions. I also especially want to thank Margit Meyer. So Margit has been my friend and comrade for, I think we can now say, decades. So I'm particularly sort of moved and grateful that you came and contributed to this conversation. It's deeply meaningful. And back to Álvaro. So Álvaro, through the process of working together on this book, has become a close friend and comrade. He spent quite a bit of time with us at the GSD. We got a lot of time to dialogue together about some of our projects. But in some ways, just as importantly, maybe more importantly, Álvaro became part of our intellectual community. This is one of any number of pictures that I can show you of. This was the end of one of our research studios in the Urban Theory Lab a couple of years ago, and we asked Álvaro to comment on the students' work, and he wasn't just kind of like an external person reflecting on their work. He had been part of our community and part of our dialogue for many months, several years in a row, and that's been really wonderful. And he's also kind of an intellectual comrade. I mean, Álvaro's scholarship, yeah, we keep drawing circles and arrows around Álvaro, part of the fun of working together. But no, we're really in an intellectual dialogue, so for me it's very humbling to have someone whose intellectual work, whose scholarly contributions have been so important to my own work, now kind of commenting on and reflecting on, introducing and translating my work. So really deepest gratitude and respect and appreciation to you, Álvaro, for your generosity and for your good vibes in this work, and I think we'll continue that project. So as I said, I want to talk about theory. So I'm an urban theorist. I'm a critical urban theorist, and I think about critical urban theory, among other things, as a project of critically interrogating the concepts, the methods, the maps, the cartographies that we use to think about, to represent, and to try to influence urbanization processes. So that's, I'm going to argue, fundamental to research and to practice, to interrogate the theoretical dimensions. Now, I've been doing this for a while, and I've been teaching theory for a while, as Álvaro explained, in a number of different contexts. And I encounter a lot of resistance. And sometimes I think, well, maybe it's just me, maybe it's the way I teach theory, but I think a lot of it has to do with resistance to theory itself. And over the years, I've started to reflect, why is there this resistance to theory? The resistance to theory, of course, has a long history, but it takes particular forms in our particular moment. It's a long story, as I'm sure you can imagine, but I would boil it down, at least in my experience, to two related but distinct forms of resistance to theory. So one is something I'm very sympathetic to, a concern with practice, a concern with social transformation. So my planning and architecture and design students, a lot of them are in the design disciplines because they want to change the world. So I teach some first-year classes for urban planning and design students, and I'm the theory guy. They've got to take my class. So I'm a barrier, I'm an obstruction to them because they've got to take this theory class and they want to get busy confronting the great challenges of social inequality, injustice, environmental crisis, geopolitical fragmentation, etc. So theory from this point of view, and I couldn't help but put Lenin, what is to be done, up there. I might be one of the few people, maybe even in the history of the Graduate School of Design, to utter the word Lenin in Gund Hall. I'm not sure whether anyone else has, but that happens at least once a semester, sometimes several times in my class. But they view theory as a luxurious distraction. Why mess with it? We need to get down to business. So that's one form I'm sympathetic to, but as I'll explain, I think it's very misguided. Second form of resistance to theory I think is much more prevalent, and that is connected to the long legacy of positivism. Not all positivism is anti-theoretical, but dominant strands are. And it takes a particular form in the age of big data and geoscience. And from this point of view, theory is obsolete because we have technological capacities to process data, to generate very complex, multi-layered maps that tell us the basic facts about the causal regularities that are producing social life and spatial relations. So it's obsolete. So this is a pretty, in some ways, infamous cover from Wired magazine from a few years ago, that theory is over because we now are in the age of big data. And there are various forms of this. I'm simplifying a bit, but there's a kind of geospatial form as well. Like I encounter that a lot with my design students who obviously spend a lot of time learning very complex tools for digital spatial, the visual representation of spatial data. It takes a lot of time and effort to do that, and it's very easy to get into this kind of framework of this stuff with all of its complexity provides a kind of mimetic capture, a photograph of, as it were, the real. They put the real world, Zizek and Lacan would call it the real, but it's a kind of, it's a kind of project and it's a kind of epistemology. But again, in this framework, theory is irrelevant because you've got all this technology, and the idea is let's find out what's going on in the ground. Let's find out what's going on the ground instead of getting bogged down with some complicated abstraction. So, as you can imagine, as I've already suggested, I fundamentally disagree with both of those points of view. I think they're not only wrong and misleading, but they're actually dangerous and contribute to the reproduction and generalization of ignorance, and by consequence, a lot of unnecessary social suffering. So I'm going to make a strong argument in general terms, but then also in more specific terms about why we need theory, and in some ways we're always already doing it. And so I'm going to make an argument for a much more reflexive engagement with theory as essential to the work of critical social science and critical design, critical policy, all realms of professional practice. So a couple opening propositions about how I understand theory. So for me, theory is not opposed to history and practice. That's a completely problematic way to think about the issues, the problématique. Theory is the only basis on which we can understand, think about history and practice. It's not separate. It's like, think about a tapestry, many intertwined layers woven together. Theory is the weave, part of the weave of practice at all levels. And the issue is the level of reflexivity about the theoretical assumptions, some of which are actually quite abstract, that we are always already making in relation to all realms of practice. So it's a question of how reflexive, how critically self-aware can we be in any realm of research or practice about assumptions that we're already presupposing. So that's one. Secondly, I want to argue that, and I'm certainly not alone in making this argument, that theory, interpretation, it shapes very actively the production of space. In Stuart Hall's formulation, he's talking about ideology, but it's pretty much the same thing in this context. Interpretations are a material force. They shape and reshape the very reality that they're trying to render intelligible. So again, it's not theory or ideology on the one hand and the real practice on the other. Practice or ideology and theory already are internalized within the realm of practice, shaping and reshaping that realm. And I would argue this applies in a lot of different contexts, certainly in the context of urban professional practice and design. Every key concept, without exception, in urban design and planning has a contested history, and the meaning of those concepts evolves through struggle. And those contestations, I would insist, are not simply about, as it were, some abstract question of meaning. The question of meaning has direct implications for spatial practice on the ground. And that leads to a third dimension of this kind of conceptualization. Theory is connected to political struggle. The struggle for the good life, the struggle for the right to the city, the struggle for social justice, the struggle for sustainability. There's a distinction from Aristotle, which the planning theorist Bent Fluevberg has built upon, between techne, which is instrumental knowledge, and episteme, which is scientific knowledge, the search for causes, and what Aristotle called phronesis. So practical wisdom, reflection on norms and values about what kind of social formation we're actually struggling for. Theory is, of course, relevant to each of those dimensions of knowledge, the technical or instrumental, the kind of scientific or causal, but also to the normative and that what Aristotle thought of as practical wisdom. Theory is relevant to all of them. And again, I build upon Stuart Hall. In this sense, theory is actually productive. It can produce or contribute to the production of new forms of consciousness, new conceptions of the world, and new visions of what David Harvey and others would call possible urban worlds. So theory in this sense is absolutely essential to our everyday capacity to think about and realize social change. Like that's a proposition that I think in our everyday conceptions of theory doesn't make any sense. But I want to insist on that. We cannot think about possible urban worlds. We cannot try to produce possible urban worlds unless we're very critically reflexive about the theoretical assumptions that we're already always presupposing. Systems of power and systems of counter-hegemony are in part constituted through the production and generalization of theoretical interpretations of what the world is, how it's constituted, its changeability, its lack of changeability, who has the capacity to act, who doesn't, and so forth. So, I mean, I teach urban theory, and I think it's actually pretty relevant no matter what realm of urban life or urban practice one is engaged in. So, in terms of my research trajectory over the years, I've been developing and trying to apply this conception of critical theory. In order to develop in some ways, all of my work over, the years has been about developing this conception of theory in order to elaborate different formations of a critique of urbanization, specifically a critique of capitalist and neoliberal capitalist patterns of urbanization. So this critique, this agenda of critical theory and the critique of urbanization, for me, has three intertwined dimensions in terms of my work as a scholar. And I think probably in terms of many other kind of allied approaches to scholarship. So one realm, which I'm going to talk a bit about later, is the critique of spatial ideology. So dissecting ideologies of urban life that contribute to exclusion, marginalization, exclusionary normalizations, injustice, ecological insanity, etc. So that those forms, those processes are inscribed in spatial ideologies. So that would be one layer. A second layer we might describe as an analytics of power and space. So in other words, an elaboration of alternative frameworks of understanding through which to understand the processes that produce spatial arrangements as inscriptions of power and struggle. In my work, I tend to use political economy approaches to develop an analytics of space, but I would argue that many colleagues in the field of critical urban studies, critical geography broadly construed, are using many other methods which are also arguably quite essential to confronting this problematique, whether it's neo-Foucauldian approaches, whether it's feminist and critical race theoretical approaches, whether it's queer theory, whether it's the new urban political ecology, assemblage theory, and so forth. Like I'm very, I don't know if this is evident in my actual writing, but my position on these matters is actually quite pragmatic. I think that there's no single method that we can use to confront these problems. The world is quite complex, and we need a certain heterodoxy and openness to choosing different methodological strategies for analyzing the analytics of power and space in relation to a very multifaceted world. I have particular methodological choices I make in relation to certain kinds of questions that I pose. So that would be a second layer. Again, critique of spatial ideology, analytics of power and space. And third, and most importantly, I would argue that the project of critical spatial theory, critical urban theory, is oriented towards the imagination of what I've recently started to call alter urbanizations. So it comes from this concept of alter mondialisation, so alternative globalizations, not rejecting globalization as such, but rather neoliberal globalization, and trying to envision a more solidaristic and socially and spatially just and ecological globalization as a project of many new left social movements around the world since really the late 1990s. But of course, that project of a alter mondialisation might be traced back to Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto. So we can build on that concept now also to think about an alter urbanization, not rejecting urbanization as such, but developing a critique of the particular form of capitalist and neoliberal urbanization that currently prevails, and trying to envision other urbanizations, by which I mean not simply other ways of organizing space, other spatial arrangements, but rather the core of this concept for me is alternative practices, alternative processes for the production of space. It's a process approach, a process-based approach to thinking about possible urban worlds. It very much resonates with Lefebvre and Harvey's ideas. And the idea is not simply that these possible urban worlds emerge, or that these alter urbanizations emerge out of our brain just through some random act of imagination, but that the work, the challenge is to excavate those possibilities that inhere in, but are repressed by existing socio-spatial arrangements at all spatial scales, from the neighborhood all the way up to the planetary and back down again. So focusing on practices that are implicit and emergent within the present as a basis for envisioning alter urbanizations. These projects are intertwined. In other words, the critique of spatial ideology is relevant to imagining alter urbanizations, and vice versa. The analytics of power and space can help us engage in the other two. So this is just something I'm developing, that triangulation. But in some ways, I think, even though I've only in more recent years started to reflexively articulate those different dimensions of my work, these, I think these concepts, this conceptual categorization, in some ways has been implicit within a lot of the work that I've done over the years. So I just published this book under this title, Critique of Urbanization. It just came out a couple of months ago, which actually contains many co-authored articles and essays from over the years, including one that Margit Meyer and Peter Marcuse and I co-authored. And it's kind of a collection of essays from the last 15 years that actually crystallize, I think, each of those three elements: the critique of spatial ideology, the development of an analytics of power and space, and the beginning of a theorization of emergent alter urbanizations. And in some ways, I think it's fair to say that the essays that Álvaro selected for this volume, they revolve around some core themes about state, space, scale, and the urban question, but they also very much articulate that conception of the critique of urbanization and the insistence on the centrality of theory. A couple different layers of this in terms of critique of spatial ideology. A lot of spatial ideologies have been of concern to me over the years, some related to globalization and discourses of the entrepreneurial city, projects of local and regional economic development that are often referred to as the new localism and the new regionalism, the whole idea of territories as units or platforms of competitiveness, very much an ideological proposition, the concepts of good governance and tactical urbanism, and then in more recent years, the whole idea that we live in an urban age, the idea of the urban world. These are spatial ideologies the critique of which has actually animated a lot of the more theoretical and concrete empirical work that I've done. And in terms of the alternative analytics of power and space that I've tried to develop, I think there are several layers, but in some ways the core, which are also very much reflected in the book, this Icaria book collection of my work, the idea of the rescaling of state space and the rescaling of the capitalist urban fabric and the role of state spatial strategies in animating and mediating those rescaling processes. That's been a key theme for many years. The problématique of neoliberalization, which Margit Meyer spoke about earlier, the whole issue of a neoliberalization of territorial governance, its contradictions and crisis tendencies and the ways in which they in turn contribute to the further evolution of neoliberalization processes. And then finally, in most recent years, in collaboration with Christian Schmidt and many others, the problematique of planetary urbanization and rethinking urbanization itself, not only in terms of agglomeration or concentrated urbanization, but elaborating this notion, which I'll say more about in a few minutes, of extended urbanization. So all this by way of kind of summarizing how I understand my project at this particular stage of my life and my academic career. On some level, I'm almost tempted to just stop the presentation right now and say, okay, let's discuss, because I think these are, even though for me, this framework is kind of self-evident because it's one that I use, I actually think there are a lot of points of contention in what I've said so far in terms of my epistemology, my understanding of theory, and so forth. But I think I should give you more to work with. So what I've done for purposes of the remainder of the lecture is I want to focus on, wait, I jumped ahead. Excuse me, I need to rewind briefly. I covered in my summary of my own work, I covered my critique of spatial ideology and my spatial analytics, and I skipped the most important thing. So that might be a Freudian slip. I'm not sure what to make of it. But in terms of the alter urbanizations that have emerged, that I've been concerned with over the years in developing these projects, the right to the city, the Lefebvrean concept of autogestion, self-management, grassroots democracy, notions of spatial justice, territorial solidarity, territorial coherence, ecological, and I'm searching for the right word because many other words that are important, like resilience and sustainability, have been colonized, or at least partially colonized, by neoliberalism. So for the moment, I'll just say ecological sanity as a way to invite further reflection on kind of alternative ways of organizing socio-nature, and then possible urban worlds. Okay, so back to where I was. So I'm tempted to stop here and just open it up for discussion, but I want to give you more to work with in terms of reflections on what my work is about and what I'm trying to do. So I really want to develop some ideas from the more recent phase of my work, the collaboration with Christian Schmidt, and which is embodied in the projects of the Urban Theory Lab, and to try to illustrate this conceptualization in relation to that work, particularly focusing on the critique of spatial ideology, but also connecting up to the other layers, the alternative spatial analytics, and alter urbanizations. So simple proposition, which is widely repeated, the world has become urban. And I want to use that as a springboard for illustrating at least part of what I think critical urban theory has to offer. So the world has become urban. A self-evident claim. It's repeated in so many different contexts that we seem to take it for granted. And of course, it's usually connected to the proposition that we live in an urban world because more than 50% of the world's population, putatively, lives within, and for the moment, I'll use the word cities in quotation marks because that's part of what we need to critically interrogate. So I want to ask, as another one of my mentors from many years ago used to say, Moïse Postone from the University of Chicago, a very interesting Marxian social theorist, when he would teach our social theory classes, he would often say, let's take a step back. And he would take a giant step back from the seminar table in order to critically interrogate this problematic ideological concept. So let's take a step back from the proposition that the world has become urban in Moïse Postone's sense, and ask in what sense? In what sense is it really true? The dominant discourses, which in some ways are quite heterogeneous, there are many different strands, of course, of contemporary global urban discourse, but the dominant discourse in elaborating this proposition that the world has become urban directs our attention again and again and again to a spatial entity, a spatial condition, a spatial terrain known as the city. There are many versions of it, but just to offer a few concretizations. The idea that the world has become urban because of demographic change. According to the United Nations famous declaration from 2007, that we've crossed a kind of world historical threshold because more people now live within the urban world of cities than within the rural world. In this particular visualization, that condition is simply represented as dots which depict the world's largest cities. That's, of course, a certain kind of model. We were discussing the Barcelona model. This concept of a demographic shift has become a kind of ideological model that circulates in many different contexts. It appears on book covers. It appears in doctoral proposals. It appears in grant proposals. It appears in the opening line of many an article and many a book. And just as an aside, I know this is being recorded, so please don't disseminate this recording without my permission, because I'm about to reveal something a little delicate. So the GSD, when the web designers were trying to write a description of our work in the Urban Theory Lab to help us promote our project, someone actually began the description of our work as the world has become urban. More than 50% of the world's population lives within cities. Unbeknownst to them, of course, that proposition is something that we've been criticizing. So it circulates, in all kinds of ways, and that's part of how ideology functions, as Althusser and Gramsci and many others argued long ago. It seems so self-evident that it's not even worth questioning, and yet there's a force from the circulation of that self-evident proposition that reinforces a certain hegemony. That's the direction I want to go with this. Back to the UN. So this is from a relatively recent edition of the World Urbanization Prospects, 2012. You have two choices in terms of thinking about spatial classification of the world: urban or rural. And this is simply a set of data tables that aggregate national population levels according to that choice, urban or rural. And there are other ways to depict the same thing. I should also emphasize that these concepts of an urban demographic transition not only refer to the current moment, 2007, we've crossed this global threshold, but they're often very projective. In other words, they very frequently allude to the looming global crisis that we can anticipate due to urban growth in the global south, where megacities are exploding and expanding and so forth. So there's something that needs to be unpacked there as well. And it's basically an hourglass model. It's a distributional model of urban change. You have an hourglass which contains world population, the sand in the hourglass. And of course, there's more sand being added to the hourglass because world population is growing. But basically, urbanization is understood here simply as a shift in the distribution of the sand. Once upon a time, most of the sand was rural. Most of the people lived within the countryside. And now it's urban because everybody's now in the cities. It's kind of a natural process of modernization. And the key point I would underscore for now is that the shape of the hourglass and the kind of internal organization of the sand, it doesn't change. It's just simply where is the stuff. And the sort of spatial framework of life is completely fixed and outside of history. There are other discourses of the urban age. So there's the demographic one. There's the economic one, which is closely tied to global city theory, a field that I've also kind of embedded myself in for many years, and which in some ways I'm still kind of critically engaging with. This is, of course, John Friedman's famous 1986 map of the global city system during the high Cold War period of the 1980s. And the idea here is simply that cities are fundamental and that we live in an urban world, because of the centrality of cities as command and control nodes in global commodity chains and transnational networks of capital accumulation. Here's another version of the same argument. It's a different depiction. It's not just transnational headquarters, locations, cities as command and control nodes, but in Richard Florida's famous spiky world map, the spikes are his attempt to represent the proportion of GDP, which is of course a national metric, which is actually produced within cities. So he uses a complicated system which actually is connected to the nighttime lights map of the world, which I'll return to a little bit later on as well, in order to try to disaggregate national GDP indicators into a more localized measurement. And what emerges is this visualization, which seems to show that cities are the real engines of economic life. And that the rest of the world, the rest of the space of the world, makes a relatively minimal contribution to the economic dynamism of capitalism. So it's another version of the same argument, and we were talking earlier about different metrics that are used in relation to Barcelona and its kind of positionality in the world city system and so forth, and the ongoing struggle over what metrics to use. Exactly, that kind of benchmarking logic is another dimension of this kind of discourse of the city as a central node of economic life that basically it powers all of the operations of capitalism. And then finally, I mean, there are many other threads, but just boiling it down to the basics, there's an environmental or ecological thread of this city-centric urban discourse, in which cities are viewed as being on the front lines of the crises associated with climate change, and also in part through the efforts of the C40 and other interurban networks of knowledge sharing. They're increasingly viewed as the sites for possible solutions to global environmental crisis. So in a nutshell, summarizing a, differentiated field of, I would argue, spatial ideology, the proposition that we live in an urban world boils down to the claim that we live in an urban world because we live in a world of cities, a world in which cities have gained significance demographically, economically, and in terms of various governance challenges associated with climate change. So I want to critically interrogate and actually dismantle that proposition. This is not, I would insist, simply an empirical claim. It's a theoretical dispositif. It's a theoretical abstraction. It's an interpretive claim, and it's based on abstractions that are contested and constantly reinvented, even though through its ideological form, the proposition is constantly represented and circulates simply as a self-evident fact that we can presuppose before moving on to debate about other things. I want to take a step back from that move and actually debate this proposition, which turns out to have significant interpretive and practical implications. So first of all, in what sense is this proposition not simply empirical? In what sense is it actually theoretical, abstract, and interpretive? I would argue in at least three senses. The claim is that the city is a singular settlement type that's distinct from other settlement types on the basis of which the space of the world is organized. Suburban, rural, wilderness. So you have a world of settlement types, and you have a set of categories through which to classify those different settlement types. There may be others, but basically it's the same principle. You can differentiate it, and many people have, but it's still the same, as it were, dispositif, the same sort of framework of interpretation. So that's one. Two, and closely connected, the assumption that the urban as a settlement type is bounded. In other words, the debate about the boundaries is a very interesting debate. It's very much a scalar debate, because the scales of the urban change from the city all the way up to the megalopolis and beyond. But the assumption prevails that at some point, the city ends and the non-city begins. There's a clear boundary. And then thirdly, the assumption that this bounded and singular settlement type is modular. In other words, even though there are many different types of cities in the world, from India to South Africa to Europe to North America and so forth, the form, the underlying unit into which that specificity is inserted is universal. And I would insist this is a deeply totalizing epistemology. There's an issue about totalizing theory, and in some ways the most totalizing theories are the ideological kind of unreflexive generalizations like this one. The city becomes a kind of concept that it's just taken for granted. You can generalize it, and then the specificity just gets plugged in, but the actual unit itself is understood to be universal. So it's kind of universal theory. So I go back to Lefebvre, I go back to Lefebvre for insight into how to make sense of such a spatial ideology. And this is from, I think, a very important book of Lefebvre's that's not so frequently read these days, The Survival of Capitalism from 1973. He writes, if space has an air of neutrality and indifference, it is precisely because this space has already been occupied and planned. It is already the focus of past strategies of which we cannot always find traces. So the idea here is that part of what constitutes a spatial ideology is that it represents what it's representing as a self-evident fact, but in actual fact, that condition is the product of enclosure, colonization, struggle, contestation, and those processes, which are deeply exclusionary and entail a lot of social struggle and social suffering, are hidden from our view through the kind of official discourse about that space. The urban age framework is an example par excellence, I would argue, of spatial ideology in precisely this sense. So, critique of spatial ideology. Part of the work is also to envision alternative analytics of space and power through which to deconstruct those ideological frameworks and offer an alternative understanding. So let me give you a sense of the directions in which my work with Christian Schmidt and others is going in terms of that spatial analytics, or that analytics of space and power, in 3 propositions. Proposition 1. There are many forms and scales of urban agglomeration, and those forms and scales have many causes. So many of my colleagues in the world of urban geography and economic geography believe that we should aspire to, and in some cases, colleagues believe that we actually have a universal theory of agglomeration, of what causes it and what its consequences are. I'm very skeptical of the claim and the aspiration. I don't believe there is a single form of the city. I don't believe there's a single form of the agglomeration. I think there are processes of centralization and concentration which need to be understood historically and theorized in historically specific terms. There are many causes. A key issue here is agglomeration, the clustering together of people and infrastructure and capacity in space. For me and Christian, that's not simply an economic process. It's mediated fundamentally, not just extrinsically, but fundamentally through institutions, through state spatial strategies. So that would be one example. The causes of agglomeration patterns are always already institutionally mediated. They emerge within a landscape in which state space is interwoven with urban space. So the approaches that try to define agglomeration simply as an economic problem and then you plug in states and policies as extrinsic variables, I think have misframed the question from the start. The terrain is always already mediated through institutions, politics, political jurisdictions, state spatial strategies. So again, people are familiar with different models of agglomeration from the world of urban theory, from the classic Chicago school, DART as we like to call it, the dartboard model, throwing darts at the urban, a monocentric model, the classic Jean Gottman model. It's kind of an upscaled agglomeration. The Ganges Plain, if you look at geospatial data on population density, even though it shows up in the Indian census as rural, because of the peculiar way in which the Indian Census Bureau continues to define the urban and the rural, from this particular point of view, it's one point of view, it looks like one of the largest megalopolises on Earth. It's an incredibly dense, interwoven fabric of infrastructure, of rail and roads and built environment, and relatively moderate density, but also relatively proximate settlement space across a humongous zone. And of course, the classic example of the Pearl River Delta in China. So there's incredible variegation in the nature of agglomeration. And what I'm arguing, and it actually turns out to resonate quite a bit with my friends and colleagues in the sphere, in the world of post-colonial urban studies, we reach a very similar conclusion here from a different route. That instead of trying to think of these formations as variations or deviations from a standard universal model of the urban or the process of urban agglomeration, we think we need to take a step back from that assumption and start from the assumption that there is a heterogeneity. As Nick Fedor and Jamie Peck and myself would call it, a variegation of agglomeration processes in terms of their scales, their morphologies, and so forth. So that leads to further questions. That doesn't solve anything, but I think those questions are fundamental. So that's one. And a person who I probably wouldn't agree with that often when it comes to questions about urbanism, but on this one, I'll sign on to Rem Koolhaas's formulation, a pretty famous one from a very interesting essay, Whatever Happened to Urbanism, often misunderstood. Koolhaas says the city no longer exists, and this has generally been interpreted as Koolhaas embracing yet another variation of the disappearing city argument. In other words, the city is dead and it's all sprawl. You know, la città diffusa and urban sprawl and so forth. That's not what he says. The quotation marks there are not mine. They're Rem Koolhaas's. The critique is of the notion of the city as a singular spatial form. He's saying there are many urbanisms. And what we need to take leave of is the assumption that urbanism is singular. I agree. And I think my colleagues and friends in post-colonial urban studies reach, again, a very similar conclusion. So that's proposition one. Proposition two, for me and Chris John, we need a theory of urbanization that is not narrowly focused on agglomeration processes, but which explores the interconnection between agglomeration processes and a whole range of transformations of spatial organization that occur outside or beyond the big population centers. And this is part of what Chris John and I call extended urbanization. So examples, during the Industrial Revolution, when Engels is writing The Condition of the Working Class in Manchester, there's a massive transformation in the supply of energy into the big cities, not just of England, but of the world, related to coal and the kind of explosion of fossil fuel-based energy systems. There is no way to understand what Engels was studying in the dense industrial districts of Manchester unless you also scale it out and look at the enclosures and sociospatial and ecological transformations related to what we might call the energetics of urbanization. Something, by the way, very interestingly, Lewis Mumford, a neglected but I think very important urban theorist, was attuned to, you know, in the middle of the 20th century. So interestingly, I'm going back not just to Lefebvre. Well, I never left Lefebvre, so I'm not just using Lefebvre, but in some ways I'm going back to other traditions like Mumford. Same thing in the United States and other contexts. So these are just maps of the distribution of coal mining districts during the period of accelerated industrial development in Euro-America. Logistics systems. So this is a fascinating map by one of the first statistical cartographers, Minard, from, interestingly, right around the time of Haussmannization in Paris. This is from 1862. So we cannot understand, just as we can't understand Engels' Manchester unless you scale out to the coal fields, you cannot understand Haussmannization. And David Harvey makes this point too. David Harvey eventually scales out beyond Paris as well. You cannot understand Haussmannization just by looking at the creative destruction of city space. You've got to scale out to the territory. This is just kind of cargo flows, not just into and out of Paris, but also London and many other major European cities. I should emphasize, this is a quintessentially imperial geography, because the flows of cargo, of course, go from the big metropolitan centers, not just Paris, but others, to the ports, which are central to expanding empires of European states during this period. So that is also part of the expanding urban fabric of the world. Telegraph cables. So issues of connectivity and information flow, you cannot understand the transformation of urban life in the traditional sense of dense city life in Europe or elsewhere during this particular, this is 1903, moment of capitalist development, except by also scaling out to look at the vast communications and transportation infrastructures that facilitate the new forms of industrial development that are transforming the built environments of everyday life. And contemporary debates about internet connectivity, the submarine cables that make all of our computers and phones connected apparently quite seamlessly on a world scale, they're not obviously just layered on top of the telegraph cables from 100 years ago, but they're articulating an infrastructuralization of oceanic space in a very similar way. And actually, many of the access points, many of the landing points for the internet cables are in similar, if not identical locations, to where the telegraph cables were threaded 100 years ago. And so on and so forth. Large-scale projects of economic and infrastructural transformation, this is the URSA in Latin America, are part of the urbanization of the world. We cannot think of the urbanization of the world simply in terms of the cities. We have to look at the transformation of territories and landscapes that supports the urbanization process. Environmental footprints, a lot to say about that, and so forth. And this leads to a third proposition, which builds upon the previous two and adds a little more content. And that is the idea that, for me, the hinterland, what we traditionally call the hinterland, is increasingly becoming a terrain of capitalist urbanization. And I say that not because I want to suggest that cities are being built within what used to be the hinterland. That's sometimes the case. There are many cities that are layered across hinterland space. It's a different argument. The claim that I would make is that what we traditionally have called hinterlands are transformed through the process of capitalist industrial development into operational landscapes. So I make a distinction between the hinterland and the operational landscape. We can think of the hinterland as a space which is appropriated for the processes associated with capitalist industrialization, for food, for water, for energy, and so forth. But the actual organization of the hinterland is not qualitatively reorganized through its integration into a capitalist circulation process. But with the development of operational landscapes, the hinterland itself becomes an industrialized space, a space which is rationalized. And in precisely the David Harvey sense of creative destruction, it is creatively destroyed during successive cycles of industrial development. So much of radical urban theory has focused on the creative destruction of urban space within the dense urban cores. But if you look at the history of industrial resource extraction, agro-industrial transformation, logistics infrastructures across the whole territory of the world, you'll see processes of spatial rationalization at a very large scale in order to accelerate and intensify the circulation of capital, A. and B, that the particular spatial configurations which result from that rationalization process and that industrialization process are no more fixed and stabilized than the built environments of the big cities of capitalism. In other words, they are also subjected to what Edward Soja and others famously called crisis-induced restructuring. And furthermore, the crisis-induced restructuring that happens within dense urban centers is directly articulated to and connected to processes of crisis-induced restructuring, spatial creative destruction in these operational landscapes. So the cover of our book, Implosions, Explosions, 10 minutes left or stop now? 10 minutes? I was like, whoa. Okay, I'll land this plane, you guys. I'm going to land it. So we're kind of not there. No, we're going to, I'll try not to crash land it, but we'll see. The cover of our book, Implosions, Explosions, you may recognize the image. It's the tar sands of northern Alberta, Canada, an incredibly industrialized landscape, an incredibly ecologically destructive landscape and socially destructive landscape. It's close to a city, Fort McMurray, but it's not a city. Very few people live. No one lives in this, particular terrain. But I would argue that this is as central and iconic a representation of the capitalist urban fabric as any dense district of any big city in the world. So it's a highly rationalized, industrialized space, and many others from very interesting photographers. Garth Lenz, by the way, is the same photographer who took the image on the cover of our book, a very interesting environmental activist and photographer in Canada. And Edward Burtynsky is another very interesting photographer who tries to capture these industrialized landscapes. Landscapes of animal slaughter, fossil fuel extraction, and also landscapes of waste. So the geographies of waste are very much also connected to urbanization processes. This is the urban age. It's not just the skyscraper, it's also this and all of the ecological and social devastation and uneven development that's connected to this particular condition. So we need an alternative conceptualization. And again, I think people who are here who are familiar with my work in the past, my ongoing work with Christian, this is our kind of conceptual framework that emerges from those propositions and which we're trying to develop further. Simply that urbanization on a theoretical level is not simply the growth of cities. It's something that we need to theorize in different terms. It's concentrated urbanization, which again, in the sense I described earlier, there's no universal process of concentration. There are tendencies which we need to theorize in historically specific terms. And just as importantly, it's not just, I'm not simply saying, let's bring the hinterland into urban theory and not just focus on the city. I'm not saying, let's just expand our analytic lens and look outside the city. That's part of what I'm saying, but I think the more controversial and maybe more productive part is that the process itself is not adequately understood if it's simply defined as concentration. You cannot understand the moment of concentration within this dialectic of implosion, explosion, unless you think of it as co-constitutive with a parallel process of, it's not simply extension, which implies diffusion, but extended urbanization, the geographies of which are quite variegated. Extended urbanization can have many different morphological expressions and spatial articulations. That's a question that has to be studied. So we're kind of joking around a little bit in our urban theory lab. The famous formula of urbanization from Kingsley Davis, the famous sociologist, demographer, was urbanization equals the population of cities relative to the population of the territory. So he's got a little diagram, UC over UT. So I thought, okay, what's the algebraic summary of the theory with the yellow double arrow as the universal symbol of a dialectically contradictory relationship? So that's intended as humor. So I kind of need to stop, and I have all these visualizations, but let me skip a whole bunch of stuff that I'd love to tell you about, but we'll save it for another day. And just final counter visualization. Am I good with 5 minutes, or should I really just stop? I'm really happy to stop if we need to. 5? Okay. Final thing, which connects up also to collaboration with Álvaro and many other friends in our work in the Urban Theory Lab. The project is to further experiment with this set of theoretical propositions. And the way that we've been experimenting, in part because I'm at a design school working with students who have incredible capacity in spatial visualization, is to try to use our theoretical experiment as a basis for developing new visualizations of the urban fabric, but also in turn to use those alternative visualizations as a basis to continue to develop our theory. So it's an interesting kind of research model, very experimental and very collaborative. We've had a lot of fun and lots of dead ends, but also some very interesting avenues. So just a few remarks about this particular route of developing the theory, also in relation to questions of spatial visualization. So just more images from our end of the year. This was from the very first one, our end of the year seminar. And we did an exhibition that was pretty interesting. We took it to a few different places in Melbourne and the Shenzhen Biennale and to Santiago de Chile. So it's provocative also as a way to communicate about some of these ideas. Starting point, a thoroughly ideological map, in my humble opinion. It's, of course, the nighttime lights map. If you look at the journal Urban Studies, the cover of the journal Urban Studies, which we love, is this picture. It's commonly used as a proxy for our global urban conditions, our global urban condition. The lights equal the spaces that we're trying to understand. That's the assumption. It is not a photograph. It looks like a photograph that's kind of, from way up high. It's not a photograph. It's an abstraction, and it's highly technically processed. So in the European context, this is the unscrubbed version of the nighttime lights map. And by the way, I should mention this work is in close collaboration with Nikos Katsikis, who's a kind of genius with developing an understanding of these data sets and their different articulations. So this is the unscrubbed, and this is the scrubbed. Okay? So, it's light pollution. You can say it's light pollution, and we got to get rid of the light pollution. Okay, maybe we do, but that assumption is not just an empirical assumption. It's based on the view that the urban is bounded. What if you don't think that the urban is bounded? I don't think the urban is bounded. It has boundaries, but it's not bounded. Suddenly that becomes problematic. But it even goes further. So the red, what's all this red stuff? Any guesses? It's various forms of extractive activity and various oceanic activities, at least in a few cases, related to transportation and oil platforms and so forth. That is also scrubbed because the assumption behind the construction of the data is that we're looking for population centers which are bounded. So any other sources of light emission, and there are many examples we have of this, which don't correspond to that assumption are simply deleted. They're just deleted from the map. And here's, in some ways, my favorite one. So obviously the United States, you can see Chicago. Anybody know what's going on up there? It may not be familiar. So North Dakota, fracking, so-called natural gas extraction, another ideological way of explaining what that is. So a very environmentally and also socially destructive form of resource extraction generates huge emissions. But in the standard version of the nighttime lights, that thing is deleted. But it looks from outer space like one of the biggest cities in the world. So, okay. Well, there's more on the fracking. This is just another, Gregor Eisch, who's a graphic designer for the New York Times, he basically put above ground all the pipes that are underground related to fracking in North Dakota. And this one is my favorite because you can see the scale of a very large skyscraper in New York City, WTC1. So these are colossal infrastructures, everyone. This is not just kind of some, like just slightly below the surface pipes. This is deep, heavy infrastructure on a very large scale, and it's just blended out of our standard representations of the urban. So, okay, back to the nighttime lights. So we decided to do what we thought of as a kind of radical cartographic experiment. Based on our theoretical framework, the idea was, what if the process of urbanization is not confined to where the lights are, but that there are many powerful, profound, far-reaching, significant urbanization processes that are occurring precisely in the darkness. We know from the history of colonialism that cartography often represents space as empty as part of a project of enclosure and colonialism. This is the modern form of that, or a modern form of it. It's not the only. So we decided, let's look at the supposedly empty spaces on this map and see what we can learn. So we decided to study the Pacific Ocean, the Amazon, the Arctic, the Sahara, the Himalayas, the Gobi Desert Steppe, and Siberia. Again, all of which look pretty much empty on this particular map. Using the framework that we've been developing, had an elaborate process of production, but the kind of analytic lens and the cartographic lens focusing not just on the idea of extended urbanization, but 3 dimensions of the urbanization process, which Christian and I are still writing up, but I'll share with you. Intensification of land use in pursuit of capital accumulation. Construction of new connectivity infrastructures to accelerate the circulation of capital, and accelerated socio-environmental metabolism, which take different spatial forms. And it turns out, I'll just conclude by sharing with you just a few of many images and experiments that we've been producing over the years by our students in the Urban Theory Lab. Pretty much within 1 week of starting this project, the map was no longer empty. The question was, how do we map what we're learning about what's going on in these places? So immediately, it was a counter-hegemonic, I think, cartography, a critical cartography. So Gerga Basic on geographies of oil extraction and speculation and financialization in the Arctic. Several colleagues and students, Danny Ibanez, Ali Fard, and others, looking at the geographies of enclosure, mining, logistical transformation, energy generation in the Amazon. Tamer El Shayal and Marianne Potvin looking at geographies of extraction and associated logistical infrastructures in the Sahara. A lot to be said about each of these, but I'm obviously out of time, so just giving you impressions. Vineet Dewadkar did an incredible project on the infrastructuralization of the Himalayas. He basically looked at hydroelectric infrastructures without which the entire South Asian urban system and much of the Chinese urban system could not exist as it does. Gerga Basic, again, looking at the Gobi Desert Steppe. And what we found was that, among other things, the dust storms that continue to inflict significant damage on urban life in Beijing and other Chinese cities are directly connected to the resource extractive activities in the Gobi Desert, which make urban life in Beijing and other places possible. So there are many kinds of feedback loops that we need to understand and try to influence. And the Pacific Ocean, a lot to be said about oceanic urbanization, a very important project around the world, that the oceans, there are many ways to understand the oceans, but an urban theoretical lens actually has a lot to offer. And I'll just conclude with the atmosphere. So the atmosphere was intended as like a kind of crazy experiment. In other words, this is where the theory is going to collapse because nobody can live there and all this stuff about the atmosphere. It turns out that I do, and my colleagues do, want to argue the atmosphere is a quintessentially urbanizing space. So I'll illustrate it with an example, and then I promise I'll stop. So the famous essay by Georg Simmel from 1904, The Metropolis and Mental Life. So Geistesleben, not a great translation, but sort of spiritual, cognitive, cultural life. He gives the example of if all the pocket watches in Berlin were to stop working at the same moment, the entire life of the city would grind to a halt. So his whole claim was that the pocket watch was kind of an infrastructure, a technology, we might even say an assemblage, which facilitated the coming together of people and the coordination, the space-time coordination of urban life. So I think that's a powerful insight. And if we want to follow that very Simmelian insight today, we have to look at the infrastructuralization of various orbits in the atmosphere and the transformation also of terrestrial space to facilitate our access to the atmosphere. So a lot more could be said about that, but it turns out that many transformations in the atmosphere, another key example would of course be space junk. So space junk is, for me, urban, as much as the junk that we put in a local garbage dump. So in conclusion, a big part of what planetary urbanization means for me and Christian is, yes, variegated transformations of agglomeration processes around the world. But just as importantly, it involves the operationalization of the hinterland to serve and support the accelerated growth of city building on a world scale. So critique of spatial ideology, analytics of space and power as an alternative, and maybe at some point today, tonight, in the future, we need to start to think about what would an alter urbanization in the age of planetary urbanization look like, something that many people have, of course, begun to write about, foremost of which Andy Merrifield. I think I better stop there. Thank you all so much for your attention and your patience. And yeah, I don't know whether we just need to stop, or is there time for discussion? Can we open it up a little bit? What's the yeah, thank you.
So yes, we have about 15 minutes, maybe.
good.
No, we don't have 10 minutes. 5? Really?
Sorry,
Bueno,
guys.
tenemos 5 minutos para un par de preguntas, 3 preguntas quizás, and then we ask Neil to summarize. I'm going to try to collect 2 or 3 questions.
Please.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and two questions. They tell me. Okay, so you too.
Okay, thank you. I had several questions, and thank you so much for that great presentation. I'm just going to have one. You start having your talk talking about the resistance to theory, and you had made this extraordinary effort to create these new cognitive maps
Yeah.
to understand the urban process. I wanted to ask now, not that much about the theoretical part, but more as a teaching, a practitioner part. And you have the Urban Theory Lab, you call it lab. And my question is, what it works from your own experience when you want to communicate theory to your students? What do you think is a good practice that will help to transfer this theory that is perceived as you know, a distraction into there?
And then here.
Gracias, Duván López de la Universidad Politécnica de Cataluña. Pues yo primero pues digo que ha sido muy enriquecedor todo el, digamos, el desarrollo conceptual para hacer este diagnóstico de la gran problemática, digamos, de esta globalización. Mi pregunta va sobre un desarrollo conceptual que más allá del diagnóstico de la tremendo problema en el que estamos, vaya también a la conceptualización y, digamos, definición de categorías para la resistencia, un poco esos conceptos liberadores que puedan determinar cuáles son los atributos apropiados en el desarrollo en la construcción social del espacio que son deseables para la revolución urbana. Y es que yo lo he encontrado, es algo de lo que he estado explorando, porque estoy, digamos, soportando teóricamente los procesos de resistencia al desplazamiento en algunas zonas y a través del arraigo de las poblaciones a su espacio, y encuentro muy interesante y muy constructivo desde el arraigo digamos, la propuesta de las poblaciones, pero no veo cómo caracterizar este interesante fenómeno, digamos, desde una perspectiva conceptual.
Yes, please.
Yeah. So I've got to be brief, obviously. Thank you for these questions. Obviously, there's a lot more to discuss. I don't have simple answers. In other words, there are no simple answers to either of these questions. But in terms of the first one, which is kind of a pedagogical question, for me, I mean, the point is that a lot of students, people in the world, they don't like theory. You know, it's just like some of us like working in different ways. And there's really nothing to be done about that. But there are strategies to address it, which is part of what you're asking. My strategy is to, on day one of every theory class, particularly the ones that are required and which, again, you're in a room, and I've been doing this for a long time, where you know that like a significant number of the people don't want to be there. They're there because they're required to take it. In other words, articulate that explicitly. In other words, acknowledge to the students, in this case, that you understand why they might have certain assumptions about what this terrain is, and then address as passionately as you can those assumptions and explain why you have an alternative framework. That would be one. And maybe more importantly, and this connects actually to your question, for me it's fundamental that theory is political, and doing theory, I fundamentally believe this, doing critical theory is a political activity. It's not like, let's bring in some politics into the theory. Doing theory is political because of the arguments, at least I've been trying to make. Spatial ideology surrounds us, influences our sense of where we are, of who we are, of what we can do, and of what the constraints are on action, individual, collective, in terms of our identities and our collectivities. I fundamentally believe that. So therefore, in discussing such issues with students or others who, they may think, I don't want to get into this theory stuff. Well, it's like, look, again, to go back to good old Althusser, that's an ideological state apparatus. The resistance to theory, the belief that we're outside of ideology, and let's just get on with life. So being political about it, you might alienate even more people by making that argument, but you also might inspire some interesting discussions about matters of collective concern about which we can disagree. In other words, we can agree that it's political, and then we have a political discussion that reflects disagreement. And that's important in pedagogy and other realms. So that's my strategy. In terms of your question about envisioning the alter-urbanizations of planetary urbanization, I have some thoughts about this, and most of them revolve around connecting struggles that are outside of traditionally understood urban areas to urbanization. So, for example, we were talking about this earlier today, the struggles in the United States around pipeline politics, which crystallize kind of colonialism and indigenous rights to land and property and autonomy. Those issues are crystallizing in a new context of exclusionary, xenophobic, racist nationalism, and also a context of the further development of kind of global fossil fuel consumption. So those struggles in a certain way are urban, even though they happen in a relatively unpopulated area. And we can connect that to many other struggles in different parts of the world. In Latin America, issues of enclosure, a concept I've been discussing in, I think, interesting ways in dialogue with Álvaro. But I would also, and this may be my concluding remark, the project of theory. This is actually exactly where I began my remarks tonight, and I'll end with this. I think it's a good way to close the circle. The project of theory, even though individuals, like those of us in this room who think of ourselves as theorists, individuals animated and contributed to it, it's always collective. In other words, some theorist might make an innovative intervention that inspires another conversation, but all theory occurs in a context of collective struggle, collective searching, collective experimentation, and particularly when we start to get into the really political side of theory, the possible urban worlds, the alter urbanizations, like nobody can individually come up with a model. And that's really where, the theses on Feuerbach, the problems of the philosophers are not going to be resolved through abstraction. They're going to be not resolved, but fought out in the realm of ideas becoming praxis. So it's not theory disappears and it's only practice, but theory gets embodied in social practice of transforming society. So that's not a way to avoid the question, but just to say that ultimately a question like that, we can try to orient it and we can try to animate it and inspire it through discourse and through conversations like this. But ultimately that struggle happens in the streets, in the world, in the territory, on the planet. And that's part of why I think we're in this kind of a conversation, is because we're on some level committed to that kind of a project.
Bueno, pues muchísimas gracias, Neil. Yo creo que el cierre es bastante inspirador a continuar con las discusiones y las luchas materiales y prácticas directamente. Tenemos que cerrar, es una pena no poder seguir más tiempo, pero el recinto cierra y tenemos que acabar aquí. Me piden que agradezca, agradezco yo también, ¿no?, a vosotros primero, a Abel y Nuria por organizarlo todo y a Icaria por continuar con este proyecto, a todos los ponentes hoy, Neil, Margit, Joan, Ramón, no sé dónde estáis ahora mismo, muchas gracias. A MACBA por albergar este evento una vez más, nos hemos podido ver aquí, y a todos vosotros, por supuesto, por haber venido a reunirnos con nosotros. Buenas noches y gracias.